Hey folks, today on the Deerskin Diary, I want to talk about 3 distinct distilled spirits that were very common on the American frontier, and also modern equivalents that are as close as can be replicated to what they had in the 18th century. So stick around, I'm testing liquors on the Deerskin Diary. Now, alcohol was part of nearly every meal and certainly a part of everyday life. In part because the fermentation process required boiling and fermentation, both of which made water safe to drink. An unknown Georgia colonist is attributed to having said, "If I take a settler after my coffee, a cooler at 9, a bracer at 10, a wetter at 11, and 2 or 3 stiffeners during the forenoon, who has any right to complain?" Now, one of the ways we know that rum was king along the American frontier is to look at places like John Hook's daybooks. Now, John Hook ran a store along the Virginia frontier just south of present-day Lynchburg, and in 1771, rum outsold every other good. It was cheap and easy to get. At another colonial Virginia store, this one in modern-day Fairfax County in 1761, a colonial consumer named Benjamin Hawkins in all purchased 7 gallons and 2 quarts of rum between October 13th of 1760 and March 13th of 1761. Now, Hawkins seems to be about the average consumer because by 1830, it's predicted that about 7.1 gallons of alcohol per year were being consumed by Americans. For contrast, it's about 2.3 today. Alcohol also played a profound role in the deerskin trade in the American South in the 1760s and early 1770s. But not everybody who was a consumer, namely native tribes like the Muskogee Creek and the Cherokee, were necessarily interested in the rum that was offered. William Bartram in his travels met 2 traders from Pensacola who were transporting 40 kegs of Jamaican rum to Muskogee Creek territory. The illegal rum traders were soon found by a party of Creek warriors, and Bartram states they forthwith struck their tomahawks into every keg, giving the liquor to the thirsty sand, not tasting a drop of it themselves, and they, meaning the traders, had enough to do to keep the tomahawks from their own skulls. Still, though, the popularity and cheap prices of rum were too much for even the staunchest of prohibitionists, and rum soon flooded its way all the way to the fringes. Rums are a little bit different in the 18th century because rum is, of any of the distilled spirits, the one that's most likely to be aged before it reaches the consumer, and here's why. Rum that's produced in the West Indies or Jamaica is then put into casks and sent generally to Europe. So it has that boat ride to the storehouses in London and other places to age, even though that wasn't the intent necessarily of putting it in those barrels. And then it's going to age again potentially before it comes to the colonies, or even if it just goes straight from the West Indies to the colonies, you're going to get potentially some aging process. So the rum that I have found that is very similar to an 18th century rum is a rum by Smith and Cross. Now, it's labeled a traditional Jamaica rum, and you can see it actually has that sort of honey or caramel color to it from the aging process. But it's not aged very long. It's typically aged about 6 months or so before being consumed, and you can see that it gets a pretty good color. And this is 57% alcohol by volume, so it's pretty strong stuff as it was in the 18th century. Now, this has that hogo, or that really strong flavor associated with it. Again, another very strong liquor. You take the cap off of this thing, and yeah, you definitely get a nose full. Let's try it out and see what it's like. Again, it's got a kick to it for sure. It's got a little bit of a burn. It's Navy strength, so it's gonna have that burn, but it has a lot of depth of flavor to it, really. You can taste that molasses in there, and you can taste that hogo, or that sort of wildness to it, almost gaminess, if you will, but not in a bad way whatsoever. I could see this being poured into tin cups with some water and lime juice added for sailors to make grog. Now, whiskey was one of the most common distilled liquors on the American frontier. but it's not the same type of whiskey that we know today necessarily. It's not delicately charred in oak barrels. It's not necessarily designed for sitting around and sipping with your friends. It was hard stuff back then, made from corn, rye, barley, sometimes with some wheat thrown in depending on the recipes. It was in part designed to take that grain crop and extend it out, maybe make some more money off the grain crop, especially if there was any excess. All right, so let's talk about the equivalent, the modern equivalent of what they would have had in the 18th century. So my research has taken me to this product by Buffalo Trace. Now, I'm not sponsored by any of these companies whatsoever. These are just, the research took me where it did. And Buffalo Trace has a 3 different products as part of their White Dog series. And this is the whiskey before it goes into those barrels, those oak barrels, to age. And this is very, very close, if not exact, to what they would have had in the 18th century. Because again, they didn't age their whiskeys until the early 19th century. This stuff, after it came out of the still, it was put into crocks, sometimes barrels. You might get some accidental aging, but it was certainly nothing that they were trying to do. So the stuff is strong. It's not Everclear. It's not, you know, one of the modern day moonshines, which are oftentimes made of just regular sugar. This, I'm just going to get just a tiny little bit to sample here. It's a tough video to do. So it's pretty strong, but you can definitely smell the different ingredients. You can definitely smell the corn in there. So it's got some flavor. It's just not mellowed. It's just not aged or mature. It's definitely got a little bit of a bite. As with most things, I think even the liquor was probably a little more harsh on the frontier, but good, really good. Don't know how much of this I could actually sit down and drink, but a really, really good approximation, if not an exact copy, of what they were drinking in the 18th century. Now, brandy, sometimes made locally with local fruit like peaches and apples, seems to have run at least a distant second to rum. In 1771 at Hook's store, there were 15 purchases of brandy that brought in about 6 pounds, but by contrast, there were 273 sales of rum, grossing 91 pounds. Now, this happens to be an apple brandy. It's clear, notice the theme here. Again, this is an unaged, it's not like an Apple Jack, although it's similar. This is an unaged apple brandy. This one's made by the Atlanta Distillery, which not too terribly far from here, and it's an American apple brandy, and it's distilled, you know, just from apples, right? So you get this tremendous apple smell and flavor from this. Now, I've actually tried this one, and I mean, it's definitely fruity, and it's definitely got the apple scent to it, but you can also smell that this is another very strong alcohol. Seeing a theme about alcohol in the 18th century. Very, very good apple flavor. It's the smoothest probably of the 3 that I've showcased here, and it has probably the most depth of flavor. This one is probably of the 3 the one that you would sit down and maybe sip by itself, maybe add an ice cube or something to it. This one definitely, I don't think, needs to be cut as much as the other 2 likely would to be more enjoyable. All right, folks, so here we are, another really tough episode to film here on the Deerskin Diary. Really fun research, really fun way to get out there and explore our 21st century consumer economy and find these little hidden gems out there that can bring me immediately back to the 18th century. Somewhere at where you get this ambiance of the 18th century. eating 18th century food, for example, but also getting to taste something that was so common on the frontier in terms of distilled spirits especially. So I encourage you to get out there next time you go to a party, next time you are heading to a living history somewhere or whatever that allows alcoholic beverages, consider taking one of these and you get that much more of an experience at the event. You could just get that much more of a trip back in time. Always remember to please drink responsibly and also never to drink and drive.